I want to talk about Janusz Walus, because the case of Janusz Walus contradicts the presentation that we received here this morning. First of all, Walus had a life sentence. Secondly, the victims, the family of Commander Chris Hani, who Walus assassinated, killed, specifically the wife of Commander Hani, Ms. Dimpu Hani, had made it very clear that she did not want Walus to receive parole. Despite the family having been on record making that crystal clear, a decision was taken by our Constitutional Court, and specifically the former Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Zondo, which indicated a reading of the law that says that Walus was entitled to parole, and that the objection of the victims, in this instance Commander Hani's family, was not the determining matter. Now, Chair, the circumstances under which Walus was released meant that he was not being placed under permanent control of the correctional services system, because within 2 years after his release, he was allowed to be deported to Poland, and Poland being an independent country, the Department of Correctional Services has absolutely no control over Walus, and if he breaks the parole conditions as any other lifer would have done and could have been returned to prison, it cannot happen. In fact, we had the unseemly sight, Chair, where Walus then proceeded to have a very high-profile media interview in which he said that if he gets the chance to do the same what he did with assassinating Commander Chris Hani, he would do so again, which indicates that there was no rehabilitation. So, Chair, we've got a serious problem. There are situations where the way in which the Minister had presented to us parole for lifers had not been adhered to. And the problem is even more serious because this decision on which Walus was put on parole, despite the objection, and I emphasize it again, of the family of the victims of Chris Hani, despite the fact that he had been put on parole despite their objection. He had also been allowed to leave the country, which means the Department of Correctional Services cannot continue to control any parole conditions over him. I think this has set a precedent that we will truly rue and be very seriously embarrassed by also in the future. Now, I would like to ask the Minister, would the Minister consider under the circumstances where this was clearly a contradiction of what he presented to us today, would he consider to approach the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs and also the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation and request them to make a formal request to the government of Poland for the extradition of Janusz Walus back to South Africa on the basis of the fact that Walus had broken South African law, and on the basis of the fact that if he was still in South Africa after that media statement, after that press conference that he had, interview, he would have had to be taken back into prison because he had broken his parole conditions. He threatened to recommit the same crime for which he was sentenced. So I would like to hear from the Minister if the Minister would be prepared to make such an application. Because I think it is very important, Chair, that we need to re-establish the integrity of the law. And this particular matter of Janusz Walus has undermined the integrity of the law. In fact, it made a mockery of it. Now, lastly, I would like to ask the Minister, while we say that no lifer is entitled, or no one is entitled to parole, how do you interpret the judgment that was done by the former Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Zondo, which insisted that Walus had the right to parole? Because that seems to undermine also that provision that no lifer is entitled to parole. And I conclude my input, Chair, by closing the circle with what I started with. There are certain circumstances, because of these kinds of contradictions, where parole should never be considered. There are certain crimes, no matter what a person says he or she is doing in prison, what kind of rehabilitation there is apparently. There are certain crimes that are so serious, and I consider this particular matter of Walus having assassinated Commander Chris Hani as a prime example of such a serious crime, not just because of the terrible action that he had committed, but because of the terrible consequences that it could have had for the whole of South Africa. We were on the brink of this country descending into an absolute depth of violence because of that. And I'm talking from experience, Chair.
In the case of Janusz Walus, he's a typically Van Vuren case, because I think he committed the crime in 1993, if I can remember. So, what happened? Firstly, as Minister, I can only comply to court findings and the law. In Walus's case, it was before my time, but that doesn't matter. It is a matter that it was a constitutional court decision. Now, I'm not going to argue about the reasons for the judge's finding, or the constitutional court's finding. The fact of the matter is, it is a crime committed before the 1998 Act. The Constitutional Court determined that he is on parole. It was 3 years. And after the 3 years, in simple terms, it actually meant that he served his sentence. And then what happened is, and because he was on parole, it was still the responsibility of correctional services to ensure that he complied. But when it came to the end of his parole term, then, and it was taken to cabinet as well, to say, and we from correctional services said it is a high-profile case. So just take note that on that date, and I think it was in December, if I can remember,